I bought an old car for $10 at an auction, but when I started cleaning the interior, I found a hidden compartment under the seat. Inside was $7 million in cash and an envelope. When I opened it and saw the first word, "Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video, and also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I never thought a $10 bill would change my life, but that's exactly what happened the day I walked into the Franklin County impound auction with 8 crumpled singles, 2 ones I'd found in my coat pocket, and nothing left to lose. My name is Laura Bennett. I was 42 years old, divorced for 14 months, and raising my daughter Emma on a bookkeeper's salary that never quite stretched far enough. My ex-husband Mark was 3 months behind on child support, and the transmission in my Honda had finally given out on Route 33 the week before. I needed wheels. Any wheels. I didn't need them to be pretty. That morning in Maple Falls, Ohio, the sky was the color of wet concrete, and the auction lot smelled like motor oil and old rain. Rows of seized and abandoned vehicles sat waiting for buyers who wanted scrap metal more than transportation. I walked the rows with my arms crossed against the cold, past a rusted pickup, past a minivan with a shattered windshield, until I stopped in front of a 1987 Buick Park Avenue. Faded navy paint, a long bench seat in the back, the kind they don't make anymore. The auctioneer said it hadn't run in 2 years and nobody expected it to start. $10, I said, half as a joke. Nobody else raised a hand. The gavel came down, and just like that, I owned a car that smelled like dust and forgotten cigarettes. It took my brother-in-law's tow strap and an afternoon of cursing to get it into my driveway. I spent that whole weekend cleaning it, wiping down the dashboard, vacuuming crumbs out of seams that hadn't seen a vacuum since the Reagan administration, scrubbing a coffee stain shaped like the state of Florida out of the passenger floor mat. Emma helped for about 20 minutes before she got bored and went back inside to do her homework, which was fine. This was my project, something that was mine, finished or not, broken or not. It was Sunday evening when I noticed it. I was on my knees in the back seat, reaching under the bench to fish out what I assumed was a dropped pen, when my fingers caught the edge of something that wasn't supposed to be there. A seam in the upholstery that ran a few inches too straight, too clean, like it had been cut and resealed rather than stitched at the factory. I pressed on it. It gave, just slightly, like a hinge. My stomach did something strange. A small, cold flutter, the kind you get right before you open a door you're not sure you should open. Why would anyone build a seam like that into the back seat of a 30-year-old sedan? I told myself it was nothing. A repair, maybe, from some long-ago accident. But I went and got a flathead screwdriver from my toolbox anyway, because curiosity has never once in my life let me leave well enough alone. It took some prying. The bench seat lifted on a hidden hinge, revealing a shallow steel box welded into the frame beneath it. Custom work, not factory, the kind of thing that costs real money to install and even more money to keep quiet. My hands were shaking by the time I got the lid open. Inside were bricks of cash, vacuum-sealed, banded, stacked 3 rows deep, $100 bills by the look of the top layer. I sat back on my heels in my own garage with the overhead bulb buzzing above me, and I did not, for a long moment, breathe. I counted later, or tried to. By my rough estimate, working through the bands with hands that wouldn't stop trembling, I was looking at something close to $7 million. $7 million hidden under the back seat of a $10 car. And tucked beside the last row of bills, there was an envelope. Plain, cream-colored, gone soft and brittle at the corners with age. No name on the outside. Just a single strip of yellowed tape sealing the flap, like whoever left it hadn't trusted even the glue. I should have called someone right then. The police, a lawyer, anyone. Looking back, I know that. But there's a kind of silence that falls over you in moments like that. The garage, the cold concrete under my knees, Emma's television murmuring faintly through the wall. And in that silence, I peeled the tape back with my thumbnail and opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper, the handwriting on it slanted and urgent, like it had been written in a hurry or in fear. I unfolded it, and the first word on the page, written larger than the rest, underlined twice, stopped my heart cold. Run. I sat in my garage for what felt like an hour, though it was probably 10 minutes, just staring at that single word, run. Run from what? Run from whom? My hands were cold by the time I made myself keep reading. The rest of the letter was in the same slanted, hurried hand, and as I worked through it, the shape of what I was holding became clear, and it was worse than I'd let myself imagine. The letter was signed Walter. It took me 20 minutes on my phone, sitting in the front seat of the Buick with the dome light on, to confirm what I half suspected. Walter Whitfield. I remembered the name vaguely from the local news, years back. The founder of Whitfield Wealth Advisors, a financial firm 2 towns over that had collapsed in scandal back in 2014. The Riverside Senior Trust, a retirement income program marketed hard to elderly clients across 3 counties, promising guaranteed returns. When it collapsed, investors were told it was a market downturn, bad luck, nobody's fault. Partial payouts were made. The story died down. Walter Whitfield himself had died of a heart attack not long after, and his company had quietly continued under new leadership. His daughter, according to one old article, Vivian Whitfield Cross. The letter told a different story than the one the newspapers had printed. In his own words, Walter confessed that the Riverside Senior Trust had never been a real investment fund at all, that he and a business partner had been siphoning client money for years, and when the collapse came, he'd hidden $7 million in cash rather than let it be traced, intending, he wrote, to find a way to return it to the people he'd stolen from. Mostly old folks, the letter said, people who trusted me with everything they had left. He'd named names, a list folded inside the same envelope of nearly 40 account holders and the amounts each had lost. He wrote that he was sick, that he didn't trust his own family with the truth, that he was afraid of what they'd do if they found out what he'd hidden and where. If you found this, the letter ended, get it to someone who can't be bought, and then run, because they will come looking, and they do not forgive. I read it 3 times. Then I went inside, locked the garage door behind me for the first time in my life, and sat at my kitchen table while Emma slept upstairs, trying to understand what I was supposed to do with any of this. Why me? Why did this fall into my hands? Of all the cars at that auction, of all the people who could have bid $10, there was no good answer. there rarely is in real life. Things simply happen, and then you have to decide what kind of person you're going to be in the aftermath. I thought about keeping it. I won't pretend I didn't for about 4 minutes, sitting there with Mark's unpaid child support and Emma's orthodontist bill and my own exhausted reflection in the dark kitchen window. I let myself imagine just driving away from all of it with $7 million in a steel box. But the list of names sat in front of me on the table, and one of them, Dolores Alvarez, $84,000, I recognized. Dolores Alvarez lived 2 doors down from me. She was 78 years old. She still clipped coupons. She'd told me once, almost in passing, that her retirement hadn't worked out the way she'd planned, and I'd never thought to ask why. That settled it for me, more than any fear of the law ever could. I wasn't going to be the second person to steal from Dolores Alvarez, but the letter's warning sat heavy in my chest, too. They will come looking. I didn't know yet who they were. Not for certain, but I had a name, Vivian Whitfield Cross, and a company that was apparently still standing, still operating, years after it should have collapsed entirely. So I made myself a plan, the only one that made any sense. I wasn't going to walk into a police station with a box of cash and a dead man's confession letter and hope for the best. Money like that, found like that, draws lawyers and headlines, and if Walter's warning meant anything, possibly worse. I needed to understand exactly what I was holding before I handed it to anyone. I needed proof beyond one man's deathbed guilt. I needed someone who knew finance better than I did. The next morning, before I even drove Emma to school, I called my cousin Teresa, who'd spent 15 years as a forensic accountant before going independent. I didn't tell her about the money, not yet. I just asked her carefully what she knew about old Ponzi-style retirement scandals in Ohio, and whether Whitfield Wealth Advisors was still in business. Her answer made the back of my neck go cold. "Still in business," she said. "Bigger than ever, actually. Why are you asking?" I didn't tell Teresa everything that day. I wasn't ready to. Instead, I asked her, as carefully as I could manage, to meet me for coffee. Somewhere away from both our houses, somewhere with no reason for anyone to notice us together. We met 2 days later at a diner off the interstate in Lancaster, 40 minutes from Maple Falls. I brought a folder. Inside it were photographs of the steel box, photographs of the letter, and a photocopy of the list of names. Though I'd left Dolores Alvarez's name uncovered on purpose, so Teresa would understand this wasn't abstract. She read in silence for a long time. The waitress refilled our coffee twice before Teresa finally looked up at me. "Laura," she said, "do you understand what you're holding?" I told her I thought I did. She told me I was wrong, that I understood the money but not the danger. Whitfield Wealth Advisors, she explained, had grown substantially in the past few years, expanding into 2 new counties, marketing new, secure income products to retirees that sounded, to her trained ear, uncomfortably similar to the language used to describe the original Riverside Senior Trust. If the firm was still solvent today, she said, it was either because they'd genuinely turned things around or because they were still running the same game, just better hidden, using new clients' money to keep old promises afloat. "If that's true," she said, "and you walk in there asking questions, you're not uncovering an old scandal. You're threatening an active one." That should have frightened me out of the whole thing. Instead, strangely, it steadied me. If people were still being hurt, right now, today, then sitting on Walter's confession wasn't caution. It was complicity. Teresa agreed to help me quietly verify what I had on the condition that we moved carefully. Over the following week, working evenings after Emma went to bed, she cross-referenced the names on Walter's list against old court filings from the 2014 settlement. Every name matched. Every dollar amount matched almost exactly the losses that had been written off back then as market conditions. It was while digging through the box itself a few nights later that I found the second piece of proof. Tucked beneath the bottom layer of cash, flat against the steel, was a small leather ledger. Walter's own handwriting again, dense columns of dates, account numbers, and initials. VWC appeared dozens of times throughout, alongside transfers that postdated the supposed 2014 collapse by years. Vivian Whitfield Cross. Whatever Walter had done alone at first, the ledger suggested his daughter had known and had kept the wheel turning long after he was gone. That was the proof Teresa said we needed. Real evidence, not just a dying man's guilt-stricken letter. Bank routing numbers, dates, a pattern. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt watched. It started small enough that I told myself I was imagining it. A car I didn't recognize parked across from Dolores Alvarez's house one evening when I walked Emma's dog past it. A phone call to my office number 2 days after that from someone who asked oddly specific questions about an old Buick before hanging up when the receptionist asked who was calling. I mentioned none of it to Teresa, not wanting to sound paranoid, but I started parking in the garage with the door shut and double-checking the locks before bed. Later, I would learn how the thread had unraveled. The liquidation company that handled the original estate sale, the one that had mistakenly sent Walter's old Buick to a general impound auction instead of the family's private storage, a clerical error nobody at Whitfield Wealth Advisors had ever caught, had an employee, a young woman named Priya, who fielded a strange call from Teresa's office asking routine-sounding questions about old vehicle transfer records. Priya, trying to be helpful, mentioned the call to her supervisor. Her supervisor, as it turned out, did occasional contract work for Whitfield Wealth Advisors and mentioned it to them in turn, thinking nothing of it. By the time I drove to Columbus to meet with an investigator at the Ohio Attorney General's Consumer Protection Section, I didn't know yet that the Whitfield family had already heard my cousin's name. I sat across from Assistant Attorney General Daniel Ruiz with my folder of evidence on the table between us, copies only. I'd left the originals locked in Teresa's office safe, and I told him everything. The Buick, the hidden box, the letter, the ledger, Dolores Alvarez, and the 39 other names. Ruiz listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Bennett," he said finally, "if even half of this checks out, you've just handed me the case I've wanted to make for 10 years. I felt something loosen in my chest. Relief, finally, after weeks of carrying this alone. It didn't last. That same evening, when I pulled into my driveway, there was a black sedan parked across the street that I had never seen before, and a woman standing beside it who I recognized instantly from the old newspaper photos. Vivian Whitfield Cross was waiting for me. She didn't come toward me right away. She just stood there beside her car, arms crossed, watching me get out of mine, and for a moment neither of us said anything. Up close, she was smaller than I expected, sharp-featured, dressed like she'd come straight from an office in a city much bigger than Maple Falls. "Mrs. Bennet," she said, "I think you have something that belongs to my family." So she knew, whatever I'd hoped, that Teresa's careful questions, my quiet meeting with Ruiz, would buy me a little more time before this confrontation. That hope evaporated standing in my own driveway with my daughter's bedroom light visible in the window behind me. "I think your father wanted it to belong to the people he stole it from," I said. Her expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes did. A woman stepped out of the passenger side of the sedan then, taller, harder looking, introduced only as Renata. I'd later learn she was Vivian's longtime business partner and the firm's chief operating officer, the one who, according to Walter's ledger, had handled most of the new client transfers since his death. What followed was not a conversation so much as a negotiation conducted entirely on Vivian's terms, or so she clearly believed. She told me my actions could be construed as theft of family property. She told me the money in that car was the result of a private business arrangement that was none of my concern. She told me, in a tone so calm it was almost worse than shouting, that people who interfered in things they didn't understand sometimes found their lives became very complicated. Custody arrangements scrutinized, employers contacted, old debts called in. She mentioned Mark's name. She mentioned Emma's school. I felt real fear then, the kind that goes cold in your stomach rather than hot. But I thought of Dolores Alvarez clipping coupons 2 doors down, and I thought of 39 other names on a list a dying man hadn't dared show his own family, and I made myself answer steadily. "I've already given copies of everything to the Attorney General's office," I said. "The money, the letter, your father's ledger. If anything happens to me or my daughter, that's the first thing they'll look at." It wasn't entirely a bluff, but it wasn't entirely the full truth either. Ruiz's office hadn't yet opened a formal file. Still, the words landed. I watched something shift in Vivian's posture, a recalculation happening behind her composed face. Renata said something low and sharp in her ear. After a long moment, Vivian stepped back toward the car. "This isn't finished," she said, not as a threat exactly, more as a simple statement of fact. "You have no idea what you've started." They drove off into the dark, and I stood in my driveway shaking for a full minute before I trusted my legs to carry me inside. I called Ruiz first thing the next morning and told him what had happened. He took it seriously enough that he had me document the encounter in writing, time-stamped, and suggested, gently but firmly, that I consider a temporary protective order given the implied threats toward my daughter. I filed for one that same week. It felt strange, almost surreal to be standing in a courthouse describing a confrontation that had started with a $10 car. The days that followed were some of the hardest of the whole ordeal, not because anything dramatic happened, but because nothing did, and the waiting itself became its own kind of exhausting. Every unfamiliar car on the street made my pulse spike. I found myself walking Emma all the way to her classroom door instead of dropping her at the curb, something I hadn't done since kindergarten. By the end of that week, I was running on fumes. Teresa noticed it in my voice on the phone before I even said anything. "You need a few days," she told me, "not to quit, just to breathe." She was right. I took that weekend and gave myself permission, for the first time in a month, to not think about the case. Emma and I drove out to her grandmother's lake house 2 hours away, where there was no cell signal worth mentioning and nobody who had ever heard the name Whitfield. We fished off the dock, badly. We made grilled cheese on a propane stove. I slept 9 hours a night for 3 nights in a row, and on the drive home Sunday evening, somewhere past the county line, I realized my hands had finally stopped shaking. I didn't know it yet, but the Whitfields were using that same week differently, not to retreat but to regroup and to decide on a different kind of pressure to apply. The offer came not from Vivian directly, but from a lawyer. His name was Gregory Pell, and he called my cell phone on a Tuesday morning, his voice smooth in the particular way of men who are paid handsomely to sound reasonable. He represented, he said, certain parties who wished to resolve this matter amicably and generously, before things became unnecessarily complicated for everyone involved. The number he named, when he finally got to it, was $500,000. In exchange, I would sign a confidentiality agreement, return everything, the cash, the letter, the ledger, and quietly withdraw any cooperation with the Attorney General's office, citing, if asked, a private family matter that had been misunderstood. $500,000 was more money than I had ever imagined holding in my life. I sat in my kitchen with the phone against my ear and did the math without meaning to. The debts it would clear, the house repairs it would cover, the college fund it would start for Emma. For one honest human moment, I let myself feel the pull of it. Why shouldn't I take it? Hadn't I already done more than most people would? Hadn't I already risked enough? But the moment passed, the way it always does when you actually look at what you're being asked to trade. $500,000 set against 39 families who'd lost their retirements. Set against Dolores Alvarez's coupons, set against a dead man's letter that had used the word forgive 3 separate times, as though he'd known no amount of money could buy that back on its own. "I'm not interested," I told Pell, "and you can tell your clients that the next call about a settlement needs to go through the Attorney General's office, not me directly." He tried twice more to reframe the offer before giving up, his smooth voice cooling considerably by the end of the call. I didn't hear from him again after that, though I had no illusion the silence meant surrender. What surprised me most in the weeks that followed wasn't the pressure. It was how much support showed up to meet it. Teresa, of course, stayed by my side through every meeting with Ruiz's office, donating hours of unpaid forensic work because, she said, somebody needed to. My brother Tom started driving out from Columbus most weekends just to be present, ostensibly to help with yard work, actually to make sure another car didn't appear in my driveway uninvited. Even Mark, of all people, showed up better than I expected when I told him, carefully, that there were people who'd made veiled comments about Emma. He didn't ask a single question about the money. He just asked what he could do and started picking Emma up from school himself for a while, no court order required. And then there was Dolores. I went over to her house on a Thursday evening, finally ready to tell her the truth, or at least the part of it I could share without endangering the investigation. I told her I'd found something connected to the old Riverside Senior Trust collapse, that her name was on a list, that there was a real chance, not guaranteed but real, that some of what she'd lost might eventually be returned. She didn't cry, which surprised me. She just sat very still at her kitchen table for a long moment, her hands folded over each other the way they always were, and said, "I stopped expecting anyone to care about that years ago." "I care," I said, "and I'm not stopping." She reached over and took my hand and didn't let go for a long time. That was the moment, more than the courthouse filings or Teresa's spreadsheets, that settled something permanently in me. I wasn't fighting an abstract case anymore. I was fighting for a woman who clipped coupons 2 doors down and had quietly stopped expecting justice. Vivian and Renata, for their part, went quiet after Pell's failed call. No more drive-bys, no more confrontations in my driveway. Ruiz told me this wasn't necessarily good news. It likely meant they were consulting their own lawyers, shoring up their defenses, deciding on a next move rather than abandoning the fight. I believed him. There was a stillness to those weeks that felt less like peace and more like the pause before a held breath finally lets go. I used that pause as well as I could. I kept meeting with Ruiz's investigators. Teresa kept building the financial trail. And every evening after Emma went to sleep, I sat at my kitchen table and reread Walter's letter. Not the warning anymore, but the part further down where he'd written, almost as an afterthought, "I don't know who you are. Whoever finds this, I just hope you're someone better than I was. I intended to be." They came back on a Sunday afternoon, and this time they didn't wait in the driveway. Vivian called ahead, an almost civil voicemail, her voice carefully measured, asking if she and Renata could stop by to talk things through, woman to woman, away from all the lawyers. I played the message twice before calling Teresa, who told me flatly that this was a bad idea. I agreed with her. I did it anyway, on the condition that Tom was in the next room with the door cracked, and that Emma was safely at her father's for the day, far away from whatever this turned out to be. I spent the morning before they arrived cleaning a house that didn't need cleaning, the way you do when your hands need something to do besides shake. I told myself I was ready for whatever version of Vivian Whitfield Cross walked through my door this time. I was wrong. They arrived with a bottle of wine of all things, as though this were a neighborly visit between old friends rather than the second confrontation in a war over 7 million stolen dollars. Vivian's whole manner had changed from our driveway encounter weeks earlier. Softer now, almost rueful, dressed down in jeans and a cardigan in a way that looked deliberately, calculatedly approachable. Even her makeup was lighter than I remembered, as if she dressed for the role of someone exhausted and human rather than someone in control. "I owe you an apology," she said, settling onto my couch like she'd been invited 100 times before, tucking one leg beneath her. "What I said before, that was fear talking. This whole thing has been devastating for our family. My mother is 76 years old, Laura. She doesn't know any of this. If this comes out the way it's headed, the stress alone could kill her." I said nothing at first, waiting, watching her hands instead of her face, the way Teresa had once told me liars often forget to manage their hands even when they've perfected everything else. "My father made mistakes," Vivian continued, her voice catching with what looked, almost convincingly, like genuine grief. "I've spent years trying to clean up after them quietly, trying to protect people, including the very clients you're so worried about, without dragging my mother's name through a scandal she had nothing to do with. If you go forward with the Attorney General, it won't just hurt me. it'll hurt her. It'll hurt people who depend on the firm right now for legitimate income. Have you even thought about that? About the families who still rely on us today, who had nothing to do with any of this? It was, I had to admit, a more sophisticated approach than money had been. Where Pell's phone call had tried simply to buy me, this tried something deeper, to make my pursuit of justice feel like cruelty toward an innocent old woman, to make me responsible somehow for harm I hadn't caused. Renata picked up the thread smoothly, almost gently, leaning forward with her elbows on her knees. "There are other ways to make this right," she said. "Private restitution to the families, quiet, dignified, none of this public mess. None of these reporters who'll be camped outside your house the moment this hits a courtroom. Isn't that what actually matters? Getting the money back to people like your neighbor, not a courtroom spectacle that drags your daughter's name through the local paper, too?" That last part landed exactly where it was meant to. For a moment, I almost let myself be moved. Almost. But something in the careful way they'd timed this visit, no lawyers present, no paper trail, the soft afternoon light through my own living room curtains, the wine bottle they hadn't even bothered to open, reminded me too clearly of Walter's handwriting, urgent and frightened on that yellowed page. "They will come looking, and they do not forgive." A man who had lived inside this family for decades had written that warning in a state of genuine terror, not melodrama. Whatever performance was unfolding on my couch right now, it wasn't grief. It was strategy, rehearsed and deployed with precision. "If you want to make private restitution," I said carefully, keeping my voice as level as I could manage, "you can do that through the Attorney General's office, with documentation, the same as anyone else. That protects everyone, including you, if your hands are actually as clean as you're telling me they are. Why would that frighten you if it's true?" Vivian's face flickered, just slightly, the practiced sorrow cracking at the edges like dried paint. "You don't understand what you're doing to this family," she said, her voice losing its softness for the first time that afternoon, something colder surfacing underneath. "I think I understand exactly what I'm doing," I said. "I'm doing what your father asked someone to do, because he couldn't trust either of you to do it yourselves. He wrote that down, Vivian, in his own handwriting. Doesn't that tell you something?" That landed harder than I expected it to. Renata stood up abruptly, smoothing nothing in particular, her jaw tight. Vivian sat very still for a moment, something cold and furious moving behind her eyes, all pretense of grief gone now. And then she stood too, smoothing her skirt with hands that weren't quite steady despite everything. "You'll regret this," she said at the door, her voice flat and final. "Not because of anything I'll do, because of what's coming, whether I do anything or not." It was a strange thing to say, almost like a confession of its own, and I turned it over in my mind long after their car had pulled away from the curb. Tom came out of the back room where he'd been listening the whole time, his jaw tight, asking if I was all right before the door had even fully closed. I realized, a little to my own surprise, that I was. My hands weren't shaking this time, not the way they had after the driveway confrontation weeks before. There was fear sitting somewhere underneath my ribs. Yes, fear of whatever Vivian had meant by what's coming. But it wasn't the kind that made me want to retreat anymore. If anything, it sharpened something in me. The way cold water sharpens your focus instead of numbing it. That night, I called Ruiz and told him everything, word for word, including the strange parting line that wouldn't leave me alone. He was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line, long enough that I asked if he was still there. "That's not nothing," he said finally. "We're closer than you think, Laura. Closer than they realize, too." The hearing was set for a gray Thursday morning in March, almost 5 months after I'd pried open a hidden seam in the back seat of a $10 Buick. I hadn't slept much the night before. I kept thinking of Walter's letter, of the word underlined twice, and wondering whether courtrooms were where warnings like his finally went to be answered. It wasn't a criminal trial yet. That would come later, but a civil asset forfeiture and restraining order hearing, the first public step in freezing Whitfield Wealth Advisors' accounts before anything could be moved or hidden offshore. Ruiz had warned me it would be contentious. He hadn't warned me how it would actually feel to sit 4 rows behind Vivian Whitfield Cross in a wood-paneled courtroom, watching the back of her perfectly composed head, knowing everything I knew and unable to say a word of it from my seat. Teresa sat beside me, a legal pad balanced on her knee out of old habit, even though this wasn't her case to argue. Dolores Alvarez sat on my other side, in a navy blue dress she told me she'd bought specifically for the occasion, her hands folded in her lap the same patient way they always were, as though she'd waited too many years for a day like this to let nerves show now. The Whitfield's attorney, not Pell this time, but a sharper, more aggressive litigator named Sandra Costas, opened by attacking the letter's authenticity before the judge had even finished reviewing the morning's filings. A handwriting expert, retained by the defense and clearly well compensated for his certainty, testified that without the original document and a verified exemplar of Walter Whitfield's handwriting from his actual lifetime, the letter's provenance was, in his words, questionable at best and frankly unreliable as the foundation for an asset freeze of this magnitude. I felt my stomach drop. This was the moment Vivian's parting words came rushing back to me. What's coming whether I do anything or not? Had they found some way, after all, to discredit the one piece of evidence that had started everything, that had made Dolores buy a navy blue dress for a day she believed in? But Ruiz had anticipated exactly this move, weeks in advance. He called his own expert, a woman with twice the courtroom credentials of the defense's witness, who'd compared the letter not to some second-hand sample scraped together for the occasion, but to 4 decades of Walter Whitfield's actual signed business correspondence, subpoenaed directly from the firm's own archived files months earlier, files Vivian herself had been legally compelled to produce long before she understood what they'd eventually be used against her for. The match, the expert testified, holding up enlarged comparison slides for the judge, was conclusive at a confidence level rarely seen in handwriting analysis of any kind. Costas tried a different angle next, her tone shifting to something more personal, more accusatory. She suggested the ledger Teresa had found could have been planted, that I myself, a stranger with a sudden $7 million windfall and, as she put it, an obvious financial motive to fabricate a sympathetic story, had every reason to manufacture evidence implicating an entirely innocent family. It was Ruiz who answered that one, calm and unhurried, laying out something I hadn't even fully grasped myself until that exact moment in the courtroom. The bank routing numbers recorded in Walter's ledger matched. Transaction for transaction, wire transfers the Attorney General's office had independently subpoenaed directly from 3 separate banks over the preceding months. Records nobody outside a federal investigation could possibly have fabricated, because nobody outside that investigation had ever held access to them in the first place. Costas had no answer ready for that. Neither, I noticed, did Vivian. I watched Vivian's posture change in the chair ahead of me, small things accumulating. Her shoulders drawing inward, her hand tightening on the edge of the defense table until her knuckles paled. Beside her, Renata had gone very still, her face draining of whatever composure she'd walked in with that morning. When Ruiz called Vivian to the stand under subpoena after the lunch recess, the unraveling happened faster than I expected, faster than I think even she expected. She tried, at first, to maintain the same composed grief she'd performed on my couch months earlier, claiming ignorance of her father's hidden cash, claiming the post-2014 transfers marked with her initials throughout the ledger were unrelated, routine business decisions she'd made without any awareness of their origin. But Costas hadn't prepared her, it seemed, for the specificity of the dates Ruiz produced one after another, transfers that occurred repeatedly and with mathematical consistency within 72 hours of new, secure income program, client signups, the very product Teresa had flagged months earlier as eerily, almost insultingly similar to the original Riverside Senior Trust language. "Can you explain?" Ruiz asked, his voice even, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. "Why client deposits from your new program were transferred within 72 hours into the same account structure your father used to disguise Riverside Senior Trust losses a decade earlier?" Vivian's composure finally broke, not into tears, but into a kind of brittle, cornered anger I hadn't seen from her before, contradicting herself twice within the same answer. First claiming she'd never personally reviewed the account structure in question, then, moments later, defending its legitimacy in detail so specific, so fluent that it made clear she understood the structure intimately, had perhaps designed parts of it herself. I watched her from 4 rows back, and I felt something I hadn't entirely expected to feel after everything. Not triumph exactly. Something quieter and steadier than that. Whatever fear she'd tried to plant in me, in my driveway on my own couch with a wine bottle neither of us ever opened, it had no real foundation left standing under it now. The truth, once it had enough evidence behind it, simply didn't need me to be afraid anymore. It could stand on its own. The judge granted the asset freeze that afternoon, his ruling brief and unambiguous. Walking out of the courthouse into the gray March light, Dolores squeezed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong for someone her age. "Whatever happens now," she said, "thank you for not letting it stay buried." The criminal case moved faster than anyone, including Ruiz, expected. Partly because once the asset freeze became public, 2 former Whitfield Wealth Advisors employees came forward independently, having watched the news and finally felt safe enough to talk. One of them, a former compliance officer named Frank Decker, had kept his own private records years earlier, afraid for his own legal exposure, and had been waiting, much like Walter himself in his own way, for someone he could trust to hand them to. Combined with Teresa's financial trail, the bank records, the ledger, and Walter's letter, the case against Vivian Whitfield Cross and Renata Cole was, in Ruiz's words, about as airtight as financial fraud cases get. They were charged jointly with securities fraud, wire fraud, and elder financial exploitation, spanning a scheme that had continued, in slightly altered form, for nearly 6 years after the public believed it had ended. There was one more charge that surprised even me: witness intimidation, stemming from the driveway confrontation and the veiled threats about Emma and my custody arrangement. Ruiz had taken my written, time-stamped account of that night seriously from the start, and it became, in the end, part of the formal record. The trial itself, 8 months later, was almost anticlimactic compared to everything that led up to it. Faced with the full weight of the evidence, both Vivian and Renata accepted plea agreements rather than risk a jury verdict. Vivian to 15 years, with restitution obligations that would follow her for the rest of her life. Renata to 11. Eleanor Whitfield, Vivian's mother, was never charged. The evidence in the end supported what even Vivian had once claimed in a moment of genuine slippage, that her mother truly hadn't known. The frozen assets combined with the recovered cash from beneath that Buick's back seat totaled just over $11 million once the firm's other holdings were liquidated under court order. Restitution to the original Riverside Senior Trust victims, all 39 names on Walter's list, plus the newer clients caught in the scheme's second wave, was calculated and disbursed over the following year. Dolores Alvarez received a check for $84,000, the exact figure Walter had written beside her name years before he ever knew I'd exist. I'd worried, at various points throughout the ordeal, about what would happen to me, whether I'd face any legal complication for the months I'd spent in possession of $7 million before formally surrendering it. Ruiz had reassured me early on that Ohio's found property statutes, combined with my documented prompt cooperation with his office, protected me completely, and in the end he was right. More than that, there turned out to be a statutory finder's allowance tied to recovered fraud proceeds in cases involving voluntary, timely cooperation, and after the restitution to victims was fully disbursed, I received a percentage of the recovered total as that allowance. It wasn't $7 million. It wasn't even close, but it was enough. Enough to pay off the house, enough to finally fix the transmission on a different car entirely, enough to start a real college fund for Emma instead of the empty promise of one. I sold the Buick, in the end, to a classic car restorer, 2 counties over, who had no idea what it had once carried beneath its back seat. I kept one thing from it, though. Walter's original letter, returned to me by the Attorney General's office once the case concluded. The word "run" still underlined twice at the top in his hurried, frightened hand. I framed it, not as a trophy, as a reminder of how close I'd come to looking away. A year after the trial ended, my life looked almost unrecognizable from the woman who'd bid $10 on a rusted Buick out of desperation. The house was paid off. Emma, now 15, had stopped flinching every time an unfamiliar car slowed on our street, something I hadn't realized she'd been doing until it stopped. My relationship with Mark had improved through the ordeal. Shared fear for our daughter stripped away old resentments. We weren't getting back together, but we'd become better co-parents than we had in years. Teresa's forensic work brought her enough recognition to leave independent contracting and open her own practice, half-jokingly named after the Buick that started it all. Dolores Alvarez, with her restitution check and a little encouragement, finally took the trip to Arizona to see her granddaughter that she'd postponed for 6 years. She sends me postcards now. I keep every one on my refrigerator. As for me, I used part of my finder's allowance to finish the accounting certification I'd abandoned when Emma was born. Teresa's offered me a junior position once I finish, a particular satisfaction in becoming someone who might catch the next Walter Whitfield before another hidden ledger has to do it for her. I started seeing someone too, a high school science teacher named Robert, gentle and unhurried, exactly what I needed after everything. Nothing dramatic, just quiet Sunday dinners, and someone who waits for the answer when he asks about my day. The Whitfield's world, by contrast, had collapsed entirely. Vivian is serving her sentence at a women's correctional facility in southern Ohio. Her marriage, one I hadn't known existed until the trial's disclosures, ended in divorce within the first year of her incarceration. Her husband had no idea about any of it and wanted nothing more to do with the family name. Renata lost her marriage, her professional licenses, and most of the friendships she'd built in Maple Falls society. Friendships that had never been about her, only about proximity to money that no longer existed. Eleanor Whitfield, the mother neither daughter had been charged on behalf of, lost the family home regardless, since it had been bought, like nearly everything else, with money that was never legitimately theirs. She now lives in a modest assisted living facility 2 hours away, estranged from both her daughter and Renata, who she blamed, bitterly, not entirely without reason, for destroying everything she'd believed her family had honestly built. I think about that sometimes, the strange justice of it. Vivian had used her mother's frailty as a shield that Sunday afternoon on my couch, trying to make me complicit in protecting her from consequences. In the end, her mother lost everything anyway, not because of anything I did, but because of everything Vivian chose to protect instead of confess. I don't take pleasure in their downfall, but I don't lose sleep over it either. Every consequence that found them was one they'd built themselves, long before I ever pried open a hidden seam in the back seat of a $10 car.